for young and old now out here. It's going to be slaughter. Rugby player to play on, however, we find Nichols trying to get a hand pass out the gully. But it's been picked up by Quirk. Quirk trip. It's been hello. Nothing on there.
Hey, my name is Darryl Christie. I was born in Ararat in Western Victoria, around about 100 odd mile away from Melbourne. Fortunate enough to play in a couple of practice games with Carlton back in 1964.
My name's Clinton. I'm from Melbourne. I was born in 1975. Grew up in a pretty staunch Carlton family. My mother and grandmother were both massive Carlton people. And I had no choice in the matter. I remember actually I had a Fitzroy doll when I was like 5 or 6 years old. I got given it to me for my birthday, and I don't know, it only lasted for a couple of weeks. It went missing, got kidnapped, and I got replaced with a Carlton doll. So from then I've just been a massive Carlton fan, had no choice in the matter, and yeah, I've seen some great times in the early 80s through to 1995 premiership, but sadly the last 30 odd years we haven't seen much success. But yeah, nonetheless, even though living in Queensland now for the last 25 years, I've nearly jumped onto the Lions bandwagon, but stayed true and still with the Blues.
Only played seconds, didn't play any senior games. They were team building at the time, like this was 1965, and you got players like Ron Barassi, John Nichols, Wes Lofts, all these household names basically. And all the younger players were coming through, the likes of Brian Quirk and Robertson, Robert Walls. And in 1968 they won a premiership, so that was the start of a real build-up as far as the club was concerned.
Yeah, I've got 2 brothers and a sister, and we grew up, my mother was a single mother, so we grew up, she done it tough, and footy was just a massive escape for me, really. I looked forward every weekend to watching the footy or going to the footy down at Princess Park or to the MCG. So yeah, it was a massive part of our life, and yeah, it's followed me. It's been with me for I'm 50 now, so it's been with me for my entire life, from being a player, from juniors to seniors, to becoming a coach, and then to also becoming a club president for my last club that I was at.
My name's Neil Trigwell. I was born in Western Australia, Port Hedland. I've got 2 sisters, and mum and dad met up there through footy, which is coincidental. And yeah, I stayed in Western Australia until I was 3. Sadly, my father passed away, and to barrack for the Blues means a lot more than just the navy blue. It's also got the nostalgia of who my dad barracked for.
Growing up in Brisbane in those days, the only football, when I say football, the only Aussie rules football that you'd see on television in Brisbane was the VFL match of the day that used to come through late on a Saturday night on the ABC. Anyway, my dad and I was sitting up with my dad, and we were watching the VFL Grand Final 1968, and of course Carlton's playing Essendon. Anyway, we hear the name, surname of Chandler, one of the players that was playing for Carlton, so there you go. That's where the Carlton allegiance comes from all those years ago. No relation, but I used to tell everyone he was, but you're entitled to lie a bit when you're a kid, aren't you,
1966, September 1966, called up for national service and joined the army. Flew over in the advance party. We relieved 7 RAR. The rest of the battalion came across about a month later. Yeah, and then the whole battalion was in Vietnam.
The military was always my calling, and that stemmed from being very proud of our Anzac heritage. So even as a 5 or 6 year old, I can remember when we would finish playing cricket at night time, and then, after pretending to be, Jeff Marsh or David Boone, that Grey Nichols would then turn into a World War I 303, and we would pretend that we were Anzacs. And I'm pretty proud to say that never left my upbringings. So with all the women that I've just expressed that are in my life, I was the only one who obviously had those ambitions of wanting to fight for my country or fight for a people that needed protection. And going about my daily business in my jobs in construction when I was a younger man and playing footy, when the Bali bombings occurred, that was enough for me. I'd sort of pushed away the dreams of wanting to become a soldier, but when that occurred, I'd been to Bali before the bombings had happened, and I'd also seen the innocence of what the place should have represented. So with America and September 11 happening, it's a tragedy, and I still think of it all the time, but the Bali bombings was the Australian impact of that. And that's when I wholeheartedly went into my recruiting office back in Western Australia and ended up signing the dotted line to join the army.
With Afghanistan, I had got some great memories. You know, we weren't really challenged. I wasn't involved in any, full-on conflict or anything like that. We did get, a bit hairy a few times. We got attacked a few times with IDF, which is in direct fire, but apart from that, it was a relatively safe deployment compared to a lot of other guys who've gone and served over there. But just the great memories of the little group that we had, my section. We were a combination of some older veteran, mature guys with some new recruits, guys who had just joined.
In Afghanistan, being such a Carlton tragic, I was bored and I missed watching my team. So I just hand drew the Carlton symbol onto the typical poo brown undershirt. And I remember saying, I want to get a photo. And 2007, probably a tough year for the club. I think we finished 15th. So the Tigers might have just taken the spoon for us. But they're the small things that you don't have access to that you had every day back in Australia. If you're a tragic like me, you could have been looking up at the Milky Way in the Chora Valley, and yes, you're worried about being shot at and blown up, but you're there going, how are my bloody blue bagger going? How are they going? And you'll come in from a 2 or 3 week stint and you'll quickly go and check who do we play in those few weeks. And yeah, so.
For me, it's family. I remember, I went to loads of games, but I think it was more because sadly my mother and my grandmother have passed, they're no longer here. So I carry all those memories that you don't really appreciate it until you lose people in your life, and sadly as you get older that happens more often. But I just remember the days sitting there listening to the radio, because a lot of the time we had the radio. There was not much footy on TV back in those days, so as a little kid just sitting there listening on the radio and just riding the bumps and the waves together, and seeing my mum screaming and yelling and grabbing a pillow or whatever and swearing, just the highs and lows of footy in those little moments I'll never forget. And I remember one day I was in a little small room with my grandmother and my mum, and we're listening to it on the wireless, as my nanny used to say, and Carlton were winning and I came into the room, and then I remember I was probably only about 8 years old, and then we started losing, and then I went out of the room again, and then Carlton started to win again, and so I came back in the room and then they started to lose. And then they kicked me out. They said, get out, you're giving us bad luck. And I never forget that. That was a true story. And they made me sit outside the door, and I had to listen through the door to the rest of the game, and we won. And then I just remember that's something that back then I didn't feel too good, but now I reflect back on it and I go, wow, I'll never forget that. That was just such a great memory, and a moment that I remember them coming out and being so happy and picking me up. And yeah, so I think, the best thing about football, especially from Carlton, is just the connection I have with family, and I've passed it on to my kids, and and going to obviously to the games and seeing them played in some grand final victories, and I'm pretty lucky as a Carlton supporter. There's people who are, you know, in their 20s and 30s that haven't experienced that. So I think you take it for granted when you follow a big club and they had so much success in the past, but now they're struggling and not getting that success. It's you take it for granted. So I'm lucky I've got those memories. Yeah.
And then it was pretty much full on. The first patrol we went out on, our forward scout, he got shot through a leg and an arm. Didn't die, fortunately, and he got medevaced out. And a lot of Vietnamese killed on that day, and we had to load them onto APC carriers, and that's armoured personnel carriers, take them away to bury them. And just a personal story, I got this smell of death on my hands, which I just couldn't get rid of, because you're picking them up by the legs and arms and putting them in the APCs, and I got this awful smell on my hands and couldn't get rid of it. And it lasted about a week, and I was just washing my hands, and goodness knows one, and all of a sudden I couldn't smell, and I haven't been able to smell since. So obviously the smell wasn't on my hands, it was in my brain, and my brain turned off my sense of smell, and yeah.
We had to go down to a place called Palada down the southern end of the Malay Peninsula in Johor, and we'd do some training down there anyway. There was a guy down there, he was an Indian fella, and of course he ends up with the name Gunga, from Gunga Din sort of thing from the story, but apparently he had worked for the British Army prior to World War II, and then when the Japanese came in, he worked for them as a boot boy, doing boots and that sort of thing, polishing boots, and then when the British came back at the end of World War II, he worked for them again. And anyway, so he was doing our boots for us where we were down at Palada, and it was a place where, you know, a lot of restrictions were taken away from us, and we were allowed to drink a beer in the barracks and that type of thing. And we used to, fellas that, you know, half finish a bottle of beer and they just put it on the floor beside their bed, you know, and this old Gunga used to come around in the middle of the night and he'd pick the boots up and he'd take them out on the parade ground and he'd polish all the boots up, but he also used to polish off the half-empty bottles of beer and that were under the bed. Anyway, we'd been told, you know, it was okay to give him a couple of beers, but don't give him anything hard. So anyway, somebody bought a bottle of Captain Morgan rum one night and left that out, and he must have got into that, because we wake up the next morning and no one's got any boots. But outside on the parade ground, there's Gunga laying out there. He's blind drunk and there's just boots laying everywhere. So yeah, it was funny, yeah.
A lot of people always want to fetch the war stories off you, but you know, the stories that I'll quite often reflect on is we need to be better back here because of what I've seen over there. The kids in the Solomon Islands, they wanted your M&Ms and your chocolates out of your ration packs, but the kids in Afghanistan, especially the girls, were deprived of education, and all they would want is a pen. And you know, it was a tough lesson to learn as a good Anzac soldier, because as a culture, Aussies are pretty chilled out, laid back guys, and to see a smile on a kid's face, to give them a pen so that they can write and see their own scribbles, like it was a really lovely thing. But to put a damper on it, we learned pretty early that it was also not the right thing to do, because on one particular patrol, you know, after looking back over my shoulder, you know, I saw a grown man pretty much thump a girl that might have been 7 or 8 just because I gave her a pen. So it took away the sense of humanity that we as soldiers could give to these kids, because like we knew we would just get them in trouble. So we stopped doing that. That was pretty sad, but then the kids would come up and probably call us pricks, like in Afghani language, because, yeah, we stopped giving out stuff.
And we sort of ended up in a little clearing within the forest area, and it turned out to be a bunker system for the North Vietnamese, and all of a sudden, all hell just broke loose. They were firing at us from everywhere. We'd walked into a real ambush, actually. We went to ground. I know there's an anthill. Some of the anthills over there, they're quite big, and I was behind one of them, but you didn't know where the bullets were coming from anyway. But and then the machine gunner one of the machine gunners in 7 Platoon, he suddenly ended up next to me, and I sort of said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Dell's just been killed." That was Dell Abbott. He was number 2 on that particular gun. You have the machine gunner and you have his number 2. He carries more rounds, belts and that sort of stuff. An extra barrel because the barrel gets white hot if then they have to change them. Anyway, the gun jammed and Dell put his head up to try and clear whatever the stoppage was. He got shot through the head and killed straight away. Dell was a sad story because his parents were anti-Vietnam War. They wanted him to go AWOL, absent without leave, just a deserter basically. But he was quite happy to go over, a real good bloke. But then his family wouldn't allow his body to be brought back to Australia. Yeah, it's very sad. And so he was buried at Butterworth, I think, in Malaya somewhere. And they also wouldn't let his name be put up on the War Memorial in Canberra. And when they repatriated a lot of those bodies from overseas there a few years ago, they still refused for his body to be brought back. And his name is up on the War Memorial now, and it has been now for a few years. But yeah, it's quite a sad story actually.
We're a very young nation by comparison to the rest of the world. But in our short history, Australians have acquitted themselves very well around the world, particularly in times of war. And we've only played a small role in things, but I think quite a significant role. I think we have a very, very proud history that I fear we're losing sight of that. And it does kind of, makes me feel better that when I see the number of young people involved in Anzac Day, you kind of think that, I think things aren't as bad as what they might appear. Anyway, as far as my kids are concerned, I like that they would remember me as being somebody who was loyal, valued mateship, and very much loved our country. Yeah, that's probably about it.
Talking and finding a safe space, or at least common ground with other veterans, offers them a chance to share their experiences with someone who's doesn't necessarily have to be like-minded, but someone who's actually been there and done that. It's extremely important. The problem is the veterans that don't talk. It just ostracises and spirals into even deeper lack of connection. So the lack of connection can be with their intimate family members, with community, with outside, organisations.
The best thing you can ever give someone is time, is just to be there for them and just make yourself available. And I've learned that, the hard way. Like, as I said, losing my mum, I just always reflect, I wish I had given her more time if I didn't know she was going to be gone so quickly or so young, So I think that's the biggest thing I can pass on is just, don't waste time. Use your time wisely and, yeah.
I'd like to be remembered as helping my mates as far as that's concerned, which I do a lot of that through the RSL. But more importantly, that a good person, I think.